On the 9th of February of this year, the General Assembly of the Anglican Church in England voted at their annual General Synod in favour of blessings in church for same-sex couples. An 8-hour debate over 2 days revealed deep divisions within the members gathered, but the votes decided the matter. And the voting was divided among 3 houses: the House of Bishops, the House of Clergy, and the House of Laity. The bishops voted 36 for, 4 against, 2 abstentions. The clergy voted 111 for, 85 against, 3 abstentions. And the laity voted 103 for, 92 against, 5 abstentions. You can see that it was a fairly close-run thing, certainly among clergy and laity. But at the end of the day, it's votes that count and decide on doctrine and policy for the Anglican Church. I mention that not because of the subject matter being discussed, attitudes to issues of sexuality and marriage and to the LGBT community, important though they be for the Catholic Church as well. But I want to call your attention to the fact that the ultimate arbiter for the belief and worship within the Anglican Communion is the vote taken at General Assembly. And a similar system pertains within the Presbyterian Church here in Scotland. Once a year, ministers, elders and deacons gather in Edinburgh with a moderator appointed yearly, and they listen to and discuss and vote on matters sent up from local presbyteries or parish communities. The point is that it's all very different from the Catholic way of doing things that has developed over a period of 2,000 years and more, what's called a hierarchical system. Hierarchy comes from 2 Greek words: hieros, meaning sacred, and archein, meaning to rule. So sacred rule, or the governance of sacred things. In the years following the resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit at the first Pentecost, small Christian communities began to spring up in the great centres of the Near East: Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, Thessalonica, Rome. Thanks to the missionary work of the original apostles. But as those original apostles began to die and disappear from the scene, they appointed delegates, individual representatives who were chosen, appointed officially and so ordained to oversee the healthy development of those newly established communities. The Greek word for oversight is episkopine, from which we derive our English word episcopal, referring to bishops. And these were usually older or senior members of the community, held in some respect. And they, in turn, would choose people from within the various communities, usually themselves senior or elder, to oversee the development and to maintain unity and purity of doctrine between the various communities. And the Greek word for elder or senior is presbyteros, and so the presbyters. Now, those small communities gathered weekly to celebrate Eucharist, because at the Last Supper Jesus had asked them to do that in his name and to go on doing it, because that would allow him a personal contact with every successive generation of disciples. Do this and go on doing it in memory of me. And I promise I'll be really there with you. What Jesus was asking them to do was to make sure that his unique life of service and of self-sacrifice, especially on the cross, for us, would not just remain a fond memory from the past, but would become real ever contemporary through the love generated among the disciples when they gathered with him for the Eucharist. He would be there, and it would be his love that would course through them, drawing them into a holy communion of life and love and truth. Now that helps us understand why the one ordained to preside over those Eucharistic gatherings came to be regarded and called priest, allowing the sacrifice of the one high priest, Jesus Christ, to continue to spread its influence across the world and throughout every generation, the one sacrifice that gathers us all into that one communion of life and love and truth. Paul would describe it in chapter 2, verse 7 of his letter to the Philippians. He emptied himself to assume the condition of a servant and became as men are. And being as all men are, he was humbler yet, even to accepting death on a cross. But God raised him high and gave him the name which is above all other names, so that all beings in the heavens, on earth, and in the underworld should bend the knee at the name of Jesus. It is in those weekly gatherings for Eucharist that disciples recognize the real presence of the Lord himself. In fact, allow him continuing contact with his world. And it's there that they reverence his presence, bend the knee, and respond to his presence by their willingness to go out and love and live with him and for him in all the circumstances of daily life. Lent is a time for a bit of honest soul searching. Do we really appreciate why the Mass is so central to the Catholic way of life and to the mission of the Church? Indeed, why it is so important to be faithful to the tradition, the Catholic heritage, faithfully lived and passed on to us by our forefathers and foremothers, often at great sacrifice and personal cost to themselves. To be faithful doesn't mean wanting to live in the past, but it does mean living out of the past, grateful for the past, intent on making what was best in the past still available today. The Russian author Dostoevsky, in his book The Brothers Karamazov, makes a subtle but necessary distinction that is helpful here. He says, think of tradition with a capital T as opposed to traditions with a small t. Tradition with a capital T, he says, is the living faith of dead people, those who have gone before us, our forefathers and foremothers. Traditions with a small t is the dead faith of living people. When people want to hang on to the incidentals of the old way, to customs and rituals and practices that are now, if you like, unconnected with the world that we live in today and that serve neither God nor God's people. You might well ask, now, where is all this leading? What's the point? Well, you've probably become aware of the recent development within the Catholic Church that has caused a bit of a stir, ruffled a few feathers, and created a fair amount of division at every level. It has become the latest hot potato in discussion and debate among theologians and bishops, clergy and laity alike. It's the call by Pope Francis to the whole Church to become more synodal. And the word synodal, or synod, has set warning bells ringing for many Catholics. Are we about to adopt the synodal system that operates, as we've just adverted to, in the Anglican Church, do away with the long-established hierarchical system that has come to characterise the Catholic tradition? In other words, Are we going to start voting for what we believe, for how we're going to worship and pray, and for what position we're going to adopt on fundamental moral issues? There is a fair bit of confusion in the ranks, you might say, and already voices are being raised in anger and accusation, even among high-ranking clerics and well-known theologians, warning of impending disaster for the church. Heresy, schism are being bandied about without fear or caution or respect for anyone. Is Pope Francis trying to do away with the traditional Catholic system of governance, the hierarchical, and to substitute in its place a more Protestant-like system, the synodal? The short answer for me, at least, is not at all. That is scaremongering on a widespread level, and that is more likely to damage the church. It leads to uncertainty, it preys on people's fears, and it creates division and disunity. I think that Pope Francis has been brave enough and bold enough to acknowledge that while the church always has been and always will be hierarchical, by God's design, it doesn't follow that the hierarchical system has always shown itself to be fit for purpose, and that there have been no glitches as it developed over the past 2,000 years, that there have been no unnecessary misunderstandings or misreadings of situations and of people's intentions and even their integrity. No evidence, in other words, of human weakness, of naked ambition, of a love for power and position and prestige, and those were the traditional temptations that Jesus himself had to face, as we saw in the Gospel of the first Sunday of Lent. Even a passing acquaintance with the history of the Church provides plenty of evidence to the contrary. Pope Francis is suggesting that we do a bit of soul searching. We have to ask, have we ensured that the hierarchical system as it has developed has in fact always and everywhere served the best interests of God's people and of Christ's desire to draw all people to himself? Or has it at times, and have we perhaps colluded with this, allowed it to serve the best interests of a few, and perhaps in some way made it difficult for people to hear the voice of Christ as warm and welcoming, as firm but true, as challenging but compassionate? Maybe the system needs a bit of a tweak here and there, a bit of reservicing, if you like, to make sure that the various parts are fit for purpose. And that was the intention of the bishops and theologians when they gathered for the Second Vatican Council. A good image, it seems to me, of the hierarchical church as we have come to know it is the image of a triangle, where authority comes from the top down. I came across this tongue-in-cheek description of that process, if you think of it. Draw a triangle for yourself. At the top is the Holy Father, successor of Peter. Below him are the bishops, successors of the apostles, there to serve the Pope. Below them are the clergy, in their serried ranks, there to serve the bishops in their service of the Pope. And below them are the laity, the people of God. And the people of God have a servant problem. There's nobody there below them to serve them. Now, there's nothing actually wrong with the triangle as an illustration. In fact, it's quite a good illustration, only if you turned it upside down, and along the top there is now what once was looked on as the base, God's people, and below them are the clergy, serving the individual communities, and below them are the bishops, serving and supporting the clergy. and below the bishops is the Pope, called the servant of the servants of God, since the time of the great reforming Pope of the very first century in Rome, Pope Gregory the Great. And that is the Holy Father's first and most important title, the servant of the servants of God. And that title has, since the time of Pope Gregory, been used on all papal documents. Now this echoes what Jesus himself had already made clear in the Gospel in Matthew 20:26. You know that among the pagans the rulers lord it over them, and their great men make their authority felt. This is not to happen among you. No, anyone who wants to be great among you must be your servant. What Pope Francis is calling attention to is that the notion of hierarchy does not imply in any way dominance or overbearing, but rather Christ-like service. So, hierarchy stays, but there is room for different, more fruitful ways of exercising that hierarchical authority, and that's why Francis is keen on exploring what in fact is a factor already evident in the earliest days of Christianity, and we find it especially in the Acts of the Apostles. There, Christians referred to themselves as the Way, and that's how Jesus himself described himself. I am the way, the truth and the life, in John's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 6. They saw the life of faith as being on a journey, a pilgrimage through life, following in the footsteps of Jesus, who was actually there with them every step of the way. He was what the letter to the Hebrews would call him, the prodromos, in Greek, the Greek word for scout, the guide, who goes on ahead to suss out the terrain, identify the dangers and the pitfalls, and get the lay of the land. Think of those old Western films or TV series like Wagon Trail, where a group of pioneers would set out to cross unknown territory and open up new frontiers, ready at the first sign of danger when the scout returned, perhaps with an arrow between his shoulder blades, to draw together within the circle of wagons, drawing strength from one another. That is what synodality is really all about. Being together on a journey, pilgrims, following the way, who is Christ himself, the pilgrim, back to the Father in our homeland. The word synod comes from the two Greek words, hodos, meaning way or road, and syn, which means together. So the church is that cavalcade, people together, stretching back through a long history of over 2,000 years and more, and moving at the prompting of the Holy Spirit even now into the future, and the possibility of opening up even new frontiers. And on the way, people want to join the cavalcade and become part of this great pilgrimage of grace, which offers not escape from life and life's problems, but an active embrace of life and a willingness to demonstrate that nothing is too daunting, nothing, in fact, impossible when Christ is working with you and within you. But experience shows us that for some the journey can seem to lose its appeal. They long just to be able to hang up their boots and settle down, satisfied with where they've got to. Like the 3 disciples last week on the mountain of the Transfiguration. Never in their wildest dreams would they have pictured themselves there with the Lord and wanting to settle there on the mountain. But they did, for they said, Lord, it is wonderful for us to be here. And Peter said, I'll build 3 tents here and we can live happy ever after. We don't have to move from here. But this experience was not for them alone to cherish and enjoy for themselves. They had to come down from the mountain and share with others the good news that this was what God wanted everyone to experience for themselves. And the disciples had to go out and kindle a desire for that goal in the hearts of all people. And you don't do that simply by telling them, this is what you've got to believe, this is what you've got to do. You follow Jesus and stay close to Jesus on the gospel road, listening to others and stirring their hearts to search for themselves for the truth that he has to offer. I can understand the temptation to settle down and stay with what we've got. I loved the church that I grew up in. The sounds, the smells, the hymns, the different seasons, the devotions, the prayers, and the Latin Mass. And of course, I miss it all at times, the Catholic thing. But maybe I'm old-fashioned after all, and my instincts are that Pope Francis has got it right. This church that I love has not been lost to me and never will be. It is a source for me of life and love and joy and hope for the future. As Cardinal Newman observed in his classic work on the development of doctrine, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. I'm certainly not perfect yet, but I want to be perfect, and the Lord can do it, and can do the same for the whole church. One of the changes resulting from Vatican II that made a deep impact on me and released new energies in my work as a parish priest was the revised rites for welcoming those people who wanted to join us on the way to become with us part of that great cavalcade of faith, the RCIA, the Rite for Christian Initiation of Adults. It was approved for use in the church in 1974. And of course it has its origins in the ancient practice of the church in the earliest centuries, when would-be converts joined a particular preparation group called the catechumenate, where from the Greek word katekeo, meaning to echo, they wanted to let the echo of the church's heartbeat and life echo in and through their own experiences. Before the RCIA, I, like all priests, simply met with anyone interested in becoming Catholic, and we would go through a long series of talks telling them and teaching them about Catholic beliefs and prayers and practices. What a difference when the RCIA came on the scene. No longer was it a question of pre-packed programs, no matter how well prepared, to be completed in a set number of sessions with the priest alone. Rather, we saw the beginning of a process of familiarization, leading hopefully to initiation into the whole Catholic way of life as it was being lived out among the members of the local faith communities. That meant being exposed to the rich and varied experience of ordinary Catholics who would welcome the candidates and be happy to share with them and with one another what faith had to offer them, how it got them through life, the challenges, but also the consolations. And that meant listening to one another. That meant telling stories, raising questions, looking at the whys and wherefores of prayers and practices and laws and rituals. When Pope Francis talks of a synodal way of being church, he's reminding us that as disciples, men and women of faith, we need to rediscover once more that being church means so much more than simply turning up at Mass Sunday by Sunday and then retiring into our own individual and often private worlds where God is rarely mentioned, where lifestyles and behaviours and moral values and standards are indistinguishable from those of the general populace, and where there are few, if any, opportunities of listening to and learning from the experience of others who are living out the journey of faith. Every year, whether there are in fact candidates among us or not, the Church continues to acknowledge that the actual process continues. It goes on for us by calling us all to an ever deeper engagement with our faith and of what it's demanding of us today. That's why we have Lent every year. You'll hear people perhaps say, oh, we've no candidates this year, no converts. That's not true. All of us, without exception, are converts, called to live in that communion of life and love and truth, and to leave behind us and step out of the world's offer. Not one of us can claim that we came from the womb, as it were, already fashioned in faith. We too had to be called to baptism, and we too continue to try to be faithful to that baptismal beginning. Pope Francis is saying that it's not enough simply to be called Catholic, to go through the motions. And if we're honest, we know that often that's the truth. All of us, without exception, has a story to tell, the story of our lives and how our faith has been helpful or not. But there are few opportunities to tell that story because there are few who have the inclination or the courage to, or the time to listen and not judge or write us off and tell us you can't think that, you can't say that, you can't do that. But we can recognise the story when it's told by somebody else. And that is the purpose and the value of the story in today's Gospel of the meeting between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. It reveals something about how faith operates or should operate in the lives of all of us. The American philosopher Thoreau says that all of us at times live lives of quiet desperation. Sometimes we get locked into relationships that have lost that vital spark that once set our pulses racing. We find ourselves working in jobs that offer no sense of purpose or personal satisfaction. We lose loved ones, parents, children, members of our community, and we can be left with a dreadful awareness of loneliness, even in a crowd. Enter the Samaritan woman, a woman obviously of deep passion and personal need, the need for intimacy, the need to be cherished. Already we're told she has had 5 husbands, but happiness has escaped her. It hasn't helped her reputation among the locals, and that's why she comes to fetch water at midday, when the sun is at its highest and hottest, and nobody in their right mind would be there. I'm reminded of Noel Coward's song, Mad Dogs and Englishmen out in the midday sun. Jesus approaches, and his approach models what ours must be individually and as church. It must be gentle, unthreatening, undemanding, and willing to listen. And gently he opens this woman up to her and acknowledges his own thirst, identifies with her, takes her where he finds her, not where he'd like her to be. I can recall as a young priest, I was going sometimes with guns blazing, as it were, encouraging people to get straight back to church. That was the first thing they had to do, and I've since listened and learned that there are often a lot of steps that people sometimes have to take before that final return. Jesus is so delicate in his approach into that loneliness, and he shares with her his own need. He's thirsting too for faith to come alive in her, and she relaxes and begins to open up to him. Loneliness can exist below the surface in the lives of many of us and create that restlessness that we can never quite shake off. It can prompt us to go in at times in one or two opposite directions. First of all, we can go off in a frantic pursuit of anyone or anything that might fill the gap, deaden the pain, take away the hurt, even for a few moments. But it can also lead to a readiness to face the emptiness and look for someone who can bring new vision, new opportunity, new hope for the future, someone to listen. Jesus shows this woman and all of us who can somehow identify with her that she had indeed been looking for the right thing, love, security, the sense of self-worth, but she'd been looking in the wrong place. It was there already deep within her, waiting for someone to release it and let it bubble to the surface to refresh and restore her to life. It had been given her, a sheer gift from God, but had become misplaced and indeed covered over. Jesus wants to uncover it and let it help transform her life. This is the good news, the gospel, that every individual needs to hear and to experience as real. I am loved, and knowing that I am loved, I can love myself and then let others love me. This church of ours, we who are church, have a lot to be grateful for when we look over the past and the rich legacy of faith handed on to us. But we mustn't be tempted to live there, to live in the past. We are called to live out of the past with all the blessings that have come to us there and to move on. A synodal church ready to listen and learn and move forward together. Let me finish with those well-known words of St. Augustine in Book 7 of his Confessions, which marked a significant moment in his own conversion story. Late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new, late have I loved you. For behold, you were within me, and I outside. And I sought you outside, and in my ugliness fell upon those lovely things that you have made. You were with me, and I was not with you. I was kept from you by those things, yet had they not been in you, they would not have been at all. You called and cried to me, and broke upon my deafness, and you sent forth your beams and shone upon me, and chased away my blindness. You breathed fragrance upon me, and I drew in my breath, and do now pant for you. I tasted you, and now hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I have burned for your peace.